India's Viksit Bharat target for 2047, net zero target for 2070, assess the newly announced NDCs.
NDCs represent a continuity and an evolution and will contribute to India's journey to Viksit Bharat.
Supply chain disruption, geopolitical tensions.
India should look at its own interests is an opportunity for India.
Leading the climate game, India's next NDC chapter. Hello and welcome to yet another edition of Chintan Speak series by the Chintan Research Foundation. I am Dr. Pooja Sehbag, Research Associate at Climate Change and Energy Transition Division of CRF, and I'll be moderating this session. Last month, on March 25, the Union Cabinet approved India's climate target for 2035, which will be soon communicated by Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. As the nodal ministry for India's climate action, MoEFCC plays a central role in shaping and implementing these commitments. Through these updates, India aimed to further reduce the emission intensity of its GDP, expand non-fossil fuel-based power capacity, and strengthen its carbon sinks. In addition, at Prakriti 2026, which is the flagship conference organized by Bureau of Energy Efficiency under the patronage of Ministry of Power and MoEFCC, the Indian Carbon Market Portal was launched. This platform is expected to serve as a backbone for implementing and administering India's emerging carbon market. Taken together, this moment provides an important opportunity to explore the direction of India's climate action, how it aligns with the developmental priorities, and how India is positioning itself as global climate leader. I welcome you all to this podcast themed as Leading the Climate Game, India's next NDC chapter. To unpack this theme, we are joined by distinguished expert, Dr. Prodipto Ghosh, former Secretary MoEFCC and India's former lead climate negotiator and distinguished fellow at the Energy and Resources Institute. Welcome, sir.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
To start with, firstly, given that you have a long association with the climate policy and also with the climate negotiations, how do you assess the newly announced NDCs?
I think the NDCs proposed for 2035 represent a continuity and an evolution. There is nothing revolutionary about it. But then there is also, one cannot accuse it of being lacking in ambition. It is, this is a set of action points which are, I think, feasible and will contribute to India's journey to Viksit Bharat and net zero outcome by 2070.
Indeed. In fact, even the announcement which government has made over there, it is very much mentioned that these NDCs are aligned with India's Viksit Bharat target for 2047 and also with the net zero target for 2070. And unlayering the nitty-gritties of these NDCs, the first one, the reduction of carbon, emission intensity by India's GDP. Earlier we had 45%, now we are targeting by 2035 for 47%. Similarly, the non-fossil based power capacity increase, that is now target for 60%, and the carbon sink, which is now between 3.5 to 4.5 billion ton equivalent of CO2. So there is a continuity, of course, but how, especially in terms of India's economic priorities. So that is very much visible over there. And now, if I have to look at the geopolitical tensions which world is facing right now, there is a supply chain disruption and also energy security concerns are there. How do you assess the ability to advance India's climate commitments while balancing these developmental priorities?
See, the current issues with the global petroleum market
Yeah.
have the potential of introducing uncertainty going into the future about the structure of the global petroleum market, and in particular that access to the global petroleum market will be determined on geopolitical rather than economic considerations. So that being the case, many countries which are petroleum import dependent would be looking at ways of mitigating this uncertainty. And India is certainly not an exception. We import more than 80% of our petroleum requirements. Now, this can lead to two kinds of effects. And these are, in some sense, mutually exclusive. On the one hand, whatever services we get from petroleum can be met also by coal
Yeah.
through appropriate, processing of the coal, conversion to syngas, and conversion to other hydrocarbons. It can also be done through crop residues and animal waste. Now, both these residues are of a very high order of magnitude in India. The annual crop residues, the total may be of the order of 600 million tons of coal equivalent, and what may be accessible at a fairly modest price is about 250 million metric tons of coal equivalent. Similarly, there is forestry biomass, which is currently of the order of 50 million tons of coal equivalent. As far as animal residues are concerned, they are of the order of 1.5 billion tons a year, and this has a potential of generating some 3 times our current demand for natural gas.
Indeed.
These are all renewable resources. Coal is not considered a renewable resource. Coal is considered a problem.
Yeah.
Now, there are some technological challenges, but mostly the challenges in accessing this huge renewable resource is economic and development of business models. Also, that one must understand that since these options would address the question of risk in petroleum markets, that they would need a payment to cover because they are mitigating risk.
Yeah.
They also would be providing environmental services, and they would need a certain amount of payments. These are not subsidies for provision of environmental services. They would also need access to the global carbon market.
Yeah.
Now, these, as I've said, are not subsidies, but they are essential payments if we want to mitigate the risk, the future risk in the global petroleum market.
Yeah.
Now, it is our national policy choice as to whether we want to go the coal route or whether we want to go the renewables route, or whether we are willing to face the vagaries of the global petroleum market, the unstable global petroleum market. It is our national choice, and personally, I would hope that we opt for the renewables route.
Indeed, we did a research on natural gas as a bridge fuel in 2025, and in that research, we also recommend in our findings, we found that especially for the CBG compressed biogas, there is huge potential, but what India utilize is only 2%. And last month in March itself, MoPNG has came up with a notification where they are trying to ease out especially the demand side and supply side challenges, both they are trying to address, and which were also part of our recommendations. So that's a very good intervention, sir. And also the initial subsidies, what you were talking about, I think that can be these subsidies which you mentioned.
Well, I said they are not subsidies; they are payments for various services.
Yeah, they will be more of the initial support.
Well,
If
they
I
can
can-
be price support also,
Yeah.
but they are actually payments for the services. They are not support in any sense of subsidy.
I see. Okay. So, what kind of challenges you see to implement these alternative and exploring these alternative possibilities for India to, immune itself from the global instability, especially in the energy landscape?
You see, as far as CBG is concerned, I do not see any significant problem of technology. The technology is well developed.
Yes.
It has been around for a long time, and the issue is that animal residues are generated in small quantities and dispersed over the whole country.
Yeah.
And they are low value, low bulk density resources. And so their aggregation and transportation
Yeah.
is a challenge.
Indeed.
There's a similar challenge with respect to crop residues, which again are low value, low bulk density resources. And the principal challenge to my mind in respect of each of these is their aggregation, their concentration or conversion in situ to compressed biogas, and then transporting them to collection centers where they can be further processed, injected either into the gas grid, and this will require massive expansion of our gas grid, or to process them further through the syngas route or the 2G ethanol route. Now, in respect of biomass, I'm talking of crop biomass, there is still a major technological challenge with respect to 2G ethanol.
Okay.
And I would hope that as a country which has a huge interest in this area and which is likely to remain a large scale producer of agricultural commodities well into the future, that we undertake this as a national mission to develop the technology for conversion to 2G ethanol. But even without conversion to 2G ethanol, and ethanol, as you know, can be used for transportation,
Yeah.
it can be used for household fuel, and it can be used as feedstock for fertilizer and petrochemicals. But the same route is possible right now at fairly good economics through the syngas route,
Yeah.
just as for coal, and then syngas lends itself to production of ammonia, to fertilizer on the one hand, and then you can condense it to produce produce hydrocarbons, and then you can run a whole petroleum industry, petrochemicals industry out of that. So there is some technological challenge for which I hope that there is a focused national research program with sufficient resources, and also that there is sufficient capex set out for expansion of the gas grid, and also policy development by which payments for these different services can be factored into the price paid to the entrepreneurs who actually invest and operate these facilities.
Indeed. And India has already even started with few of the technology missions, like CCUS is there, carbon capture, storage and utilization mission. So we have green hydrogen mission. And of course, we need to further explore and also look at the feasible technologies which are implemented, deployable in Indian context. So, moving further, especially with regards to global climate governance, at this point, one can, the only agreement that can be that global climate governance is at crossroads. US has withdrawn, it has stepped back from UNFCCC and also Paris Agreement. The European countries, the days when you were lead climate negotiator, they were taking the lead and announcing their mitigation targets and coal phase out especially. And now many of them are reconsidering their timelines. For Italy, the timeline was 2025 and now it is 2038, and they are also reconsidering opening their closed coal plants. So the energy, especially the current energy crisis, is leading its cascading effects to the governance. So how should India navigate its trajectory apart from, of course, we need to explore the technologies, we need to experiment or have dedicated missions within the country, but in the global diaspora, in the global platforms, how India should balance its leadership?
I think rather than trying to focus on global leadership, India should look at its own interests, its own energy security imperatives,
Yeah.
its own economic aspirations, its imperative of providing employment. And I think that by focusing on these aspects, we will be able to evolve national approaches to climate change mitigation as well as adaptation,
Adaptation.
which set an example to the world, and thereby leadership in whichever thought leadership or policy leadership that will devolve on India automatically by way of recognition of its accomplishments and of its efforts.
I see. So, also but there are, active attempts, and if not to say attempts, but there are certain leadership positions which India has already taken, like BRICS presidency. We have, we hold the presidency seat for 2026 this very year, and also we have announced the interest to host UNFCCC COP conference later this decade, in 2028. So, how should India utilize these platforms to leverage its position, especially when we look at climate finance? We have witnessed COP29 in Baku and the kind of how it unfolded, and especially Indian interest has been in favor of increasing climate finance support, and similar turn of events also in Belém. So how should India utilize when it has it has the leadership seat, especially the BRICS presidency?
You see, the BRICS presidency, I think, in respect of climate change, is an opportunity for India to test fly certain ideas. So, if the coalition of BRICS partners that they are receptive towards certain initiatives and ideas, then it has a good chance that it will be broadly accepted in the global community. Now, what are the precise agendas that India could pursue when it becomes COP president? You have mentioned about climate finance.
Yes.
I think we should be clear that, and we should have no illusions about the matter, that global carbon public finance
Yeah.
from the budgets of developed countries will not increase significantly o- over the next decade or so, or maybe even further into the future. But what we require are several trillions of dollars of investment money for both mitigation and adaptation. Now, with respect to adaptation, there are challenges in projectizing the different initiatives. Some areas it is possible, some areas it is much more difficult. With respect to mitigation, it is much more feasible to projectize them so that they become revenue generators for the investors. But here's the big issue, that while there is sufficient money in the global financial system to yield several trillions of dollars a year for the, not just for India, but for all developing countries, there is a very high risk perception which may not actually be warranted by the data that one has. As a result of which, while a typical developed country, like say a country in Western Europe, it can borrow for 10 or 15 years at 2% in US dollars. For India to access that same money would have to pay maybe 4 to 5%. And for a sub-Saharan African country, it would be of the order of 10 to 12%. So at these interest rates, it is just not feasible for most developing countries to significantly access these resources. So, to my mind, India could pursue the agenda of using the available global public money, especially which is grant money, to mitigate the perceived risk in lending to developing countries. So that the interest rates which they are able to get from the global capital markets is comparable to what developed countries pay. That will, to my mind, mitigate the problem of accessing money for climate action to a great extent. But we must also be aware of one thing. Countries do not have an infinite capacity to absorb money if it were to come. And this is because of a well-known macroeconomic phenomenon, that if there is an external flow of foreign resources, the exchange rate appreciates. And when the exchange rate appreciates, then the country's export sectors become uncompetitive and import sectors become more competitive. So this results in an actual reduction in the tradable industrial sectors. Now, there are ways to mitigate this, but each of them has its problems, So one must understand that one must scale climate action to a level at which it does not have, where the access to external money does not have the effect of actually spoiling the country's trade competitiveness in the international markets.
I completely agree with your stance on climate finance, especially garnering it through the public finance. Global north, the developed countries may not see it feasible, let alone today, maybe even in the longer run. So, would it not be pragmatic for global south countries to leverage an alternative way of garnering the financial instruments for itself? Like, for example, within the BRICS we have new development bank, how it can be utilized to garner the financial instruments.
Okay, I think you need to understand how exactly a development bank works. In a development bank, the countries have their respective shares, part of which is paid up and part of which is pledged. And it's on the basis of the share capital. And this share capital is actually assigned by political negotiation. On the basis of this of the share capital, these banks borrow from the global capital markets. And then what the function that these development banks perform is that they prepare the projects, investment projects, mostly in the public sector, but some in the private sector in the developing countries, and lend them on further. The point is that since the share capital is held by a number of countries, the risk perception of these development banks is less than that of many individual developing countries. So they are able to borrow from the international capital markets at a significantly lower rate than individual developing countries would. Now, what you say, the way this might work is that, say, the BRICS Bank, which has been set up by the developing countries, that it could borrow from the international capital markets at a rate lower than what individual developing countries might be able to borrow. But still, it will not significantly reduce the gap between 10 and 12% to 2%.
Yeah.
It may reduce it from 10 or 12% to 8%,
8%.
7%, but still there's a long way to go. So, for that, what I would actually suggest is that whatever public finance, grant public finance is available, that should be routed through these development banks to address the remaining risk perception of developing countries, so that so in a sense that they act as risk guarantors,
Yeah.
using that they provide risk mitigation services to reduce the interest rates to the developing countries. Now, an exercise to this effect was underway in the World Bank before the start of this year,
Okay.
but I'm not sure where this exercise is at present. But this kind of a exercise could be done independently by financial institutions in the south, like the BRICS Bank,
Yeah.
and they can perform the same function.
Okay, so there would be a bit of change, a bit of reduction, a bit of benefit, maybe, as you said, from 12% to 8%, but not from 12%
Yeah, but
to
it can go
2%.
further. To go from 8% to 2%,
Yeah.
they would have to access the grant money
Yeah.
component of international public finance. So, say $200 billion a year is international public finance. Maybe half of that is grant money.
Yeah.
So that $100 billion can be used to mitigate the risks
risk.
of a much larger amount.
Indeed. So that can be utilized to catalyze the benefit of the existing climate finance.
That's right.
That
It will leverage what is possible from
Yeah.
the existing climate finance.
That can be a solution instead of a complete no solution situation. And
No, there are solutions.
Yeah.
The point is that one needs to organize these solutions. One needs the political will.
What would be those solutions?
No, as I mentioned, for example, blending the international public finance money
Yeah.
with the commercial borrowing to reduce the
The
risk perception for
mitigation
developing
risk, yeah.
countries.
Indeed. And also, the mitigation and adaptation divide, which has been in the climate finance for a long time. The mitigation has received more share of climate finance than the adaptation projects. So, for developing countries, it is important to have more of the adaptation share. So, how do you see, should countries like India support its own adaptation priorities?
Actually, India has been spending a very large part of its budget on adaptation to climate risks. We have not been calling it
Yeah.
adaptation funding for so long, for many years.
Yeah.
But in fact, the total money spent on addressing risks from climate is larger than our defense expenditure. And this was established in one of the economic surveys done a few years ago by the Department of Economic Affairs. So people were surprised that this is the scale of the resources that India actually spends on adaptation funding. Now the point is that relatively few adaptation initiatives can lend themselves to being cast as projects which can be profitable investments for the private sector, whether international or national. And that is one challenge that has to be overcome if more of financial resources, not necessarily what we call climate finance through the UNFCC,
Yeah.
if that is to be brought to bear on adaptation. Now, almost all the adaptation money that is spent in India is spent through the state governments and the central government.
Yeah.
Very little is actually spent
By the private.
by the private sector. But there are some initiatives which are spent by the private sector. For example, there are companies which undertake sustainable irrigation,
Yeah.
and they do it at a profit.
Okay.
And so these are examples. Then there are companies which are investing in forestry.
Yes.
So forestry is a major adaptation as well as mitigation option.
Yeah.
So it is not as if nothing can be invested in by the private sector, but the scope for that is relatively little. Also, we must understand that the global politics of climate change, there's a large element of marketing of technologies. And so the reason why a larger proportion of the funding, of the public money for funding goes to mitigation is precisely because the countries which are providing these resources are interested in selling their technologies and capital equipment.
Okay.
So it's a policy choice by these countries.
Indeed. So, speaking of the domestic sector, I mean India's own climate policies. We have all our targets, the NDC targets. They are very much aligned with our policies. When we speak of emission reduction, there are set of policies which are supporting it, and be it the non-fossil based, power capacity expansion. We have, PM Kusum and many other policies which are aligned. And for carbon sink, we have Green India Mission and also Campa Act, which are supporting the afforestation. And speaking of, as you rightly mentioned, of the adaptation activity, the forestry has both mitigation and adaptation angle to it, and we have paid more of thrust to increasing our carbon sink, which is also an adaptation action. So, where do you see, the scope for improvement, especially in the policies of which are directly linked with the adaptation?
You see, the point is that as far as budgetary resources are concerned,
Yeah.
we are spending a very significant part of our budgetary resources on adaptation. Now, I think that there can be policy initiatives by which we challenge the private sector to come up with adaptation projects which give commercial returns, but for which the government gives matching support.
Hmm.
And this way, I think we can also leverage private funds using public funds or fiscal resources to enhance the scale of our adaptation funding.
Okay. So mostly the funding, that's where we should have our thrust.
That uh, we should try now innovative policies and options for scaling up the adaptation expenditures through leveraging private resources. Also, however, I think that one area where we can significantly increase our our adaptation funding is in the area of forestry. And as
Yeah.
we discussed that forestry is both for mitigation and adaptation.
Yeah.
And I think that both with respect to mitigation and adaptation, forestry is a very key option,
Yes.
and for which we certainly must be spending much more.
Indeed. And also India is one of the most biodiverse country, and it's very much feasible and possible for us. I don't want to close this conversation without speaking of coal. We have spoke of the liquid fossils, but coal has how important is coal for India at this point, especially in terms of its developmental aspiration for 2047, and also though for the long term we are planning, like for example CCUS. This is a long term vision for eventually. How important is coal for India's developmental aspiration as it advances its energy transition, and what role can technologies like CCUS play in decarbonizing hard to abate sectors and without compromising growth and energy security?
You see, coal is still the mainstay of our power sector, steel sector, cement sector, and many other industrial sectors.
Indeed.
Yet it will still take several decades before we are able to fully phase out coal from our energy system,
Yeah.
as well as in major industrial sectors. And in any case, the existing investments in coal-based power plants and so on, we may not increase the scale of investments,
Yeah.
but at least they should run their economic life. Otherwise, we are compromising on our growth
Interests.
projections.
Yeah.
So it is still very important. Now, you have asked about CCUS. About utilization, I have my doubts as to whether it is possible at large scale, because we are speaking about hundreds of millions of tons a year
Yeah.
of CO2.
Yeah.
And I do not think that there are any utilization options which can actually use CO2 of that scale.
Yes.
Now, as far as sequestration is concerned, I don't think we have fully mapped our potential geological sites for sequestration. Also, they must be in a reasonable proximity
Yes.
to the CO2 generating power plants and sectors. Otherwise, the transportation to the geological formations would be quite expensive. So I would still hold my bets on CCUS being a feasible large scale option for decarbonization, and I would rather put my bet on renewables and nuclear, and further R&D in technologies to bring the costs down and the reliability higher of these technologies.
Okay, so we have reached the fag end of this podcast. CRF is a young organization and we are striving to contribute to India's policy ecosystem. And the Center for Climate Change and Energy Transition, we work at climate mitigation, adaptation, climate finance, disaster resilience, and also energy transition areas like natural gas, green hydrogen, critical minerals, and nuclear. So, where you have rich experience, so what would be your advice? What kind of work we should take further?
I think you should stay very closely in touch with both industry and government and try to get a sense of their priorities, because, as I understand it, you're an applied policy research organization. You're not a fundamental research organization.
Yeah.
And so it is important that for you to identify your areas of research through contact with industry and the government, and also that whatever research outputs you produce, you have to expose them to a reality check with these two constituents.
Indeed. Thank you so much, Dr. Ghosh, for sharing such insightful and thought provoking perspectives with us today. Your reflections have truly helped unpack the multiple dimensions of India's evolving climate and energy transition pathways. As India navigates this critical decade, conversation like this become all the more important in shaping informed and balanced policy discourse. Thank you to our viewers for joining us with this edition of Chintan Speak series. We look forward to continuing this discussion. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.